He never loved you the way he loved this family. Everything your father built, he built it for us, not for you. My brother said that to me at my father's funeral, not in private, not quietly. He said it standing in the driveway of the house I grew up in, loud enough for 2 uncles and my father's oldest friend to hear. I was 31 years old, and I stood there holding a paper plate with a piece of cold casserole on it, and I didn't say a word. That was the moment I decided to stop arguing and start paying attention. My name is Daniel Marsh. For most of my adult life, the story of our family went like this. My older brother Marcus was the responsible one. He stayed close to home. He helped my father run the hardware business. He managed the finances after my mother passed. He sacrificed his own ambitions so the family could stay together. And I was the one who left. Went to college out of state, took a job in Phoenix, didn't come home enough, didn't help enough, didn't appreciate enough. I had heard that version so many times it had started to feel like the truth. But the thing about a story that someone else controls is that it only holds together as long as you never look at the receipts. My father, Raymond Marsh, spent 40 years building Marsh Hardware Supply, a mid-sized wholesale distribution business in central Ohio. It wasn't glamorous. He drove a used Ford F-150 well into his 60s because he said a man shouldn't spend money trying to look like something he wasn't. He believed in paperwork. He kept records of everything. Invoices, contracts, correspondence going back to the 1980s. He used to say that memory was for people who had nothing to prove. He died in March 2 years ago, after a short battle with pancreatic cancer. He had 4 months from diagnosis to the end, and for most of that time he was still sharp, still himself. We had real conversations. He told me things about his life I hadn't known, about how he'd built the business from nothing, about the years when he and my mother ate peanut butter sandwiches for dinner so they could make payroll on Fridays. What he did not tell me, and what I did not know until much later, was what he had put in his will. Marcus handled the estate. That felt natural. He had power of attorney during my father's illness, and had been the one managing the business day to day for the last several years. I was in Phoenix. I trusted that things would be handled fairly. I trusted my brother. The first sign that something was wrong came about 6 weeks after the funeral. I called Marcus to ask about the timeline for the estate settlement. My father had owned the business outright, plus the house and about 60 acres of farmland outside of town that had been in the family for 3 generations. Not a fortune by some people's standards, but substantial, more than enough to matter. Marcus told me the estate was complicated. He said there were debts I didn't know about, business loans that had come due, back taxes. He said the attorney was still sorting through everything and it would be a while. He said it the way you say something to a person you don't expect to push back. I said okay, and I let another month go by. Then I went home for a cousin's wedding in June, and I stopped by the hardware store just to see it. The woman at the front counter, Carol, had worked for my father for over 20 years. She looked surprised to see me, not the good kind of surprised. We made small talk for a minute, and then she said something I've thought about every day since. "I'm glad someone from the family finally came by," she said. "I wasn't sure who to call." I asked her what she meant. She glanced toward the back office where Marcus had been working and lowered her voice. "There have just been some changes lately," she said carefully. "Inventory decisions, vendor accounts, things that felt a little fast." That was all she said. But the way she said it stayed with me the whole drive back to my hotel. That night I sat on the edge of the bed in a Hampton Inn off Route 30. And I made a decision. I stopped telling myself the story that Marcus was handling things. I started asking what was actually true. I grew up spending summers at that hardware store. I knew the suppliers, the account numbers, the seasonal patterns of the business. And I had spent the last 8 years working as a forensic accountant for a firm in Phoenix that specialized in estate disputes and commercial litigation. I examined financial records professionally. I testified in court. I knew exactly what a paper trail looked like when someone was trying to bury it. That was information my brother had apparently forgotten. I did not call Marcus. I did not confront anyone. I booked a flight back to Ohio 3 weeks later, and I told my brother I was coming to help wrap up the estate. I said I felt guilty for leaving everything on his shoulders. He told me that wasn't necessary. I said I wanted to anyway. He didn't push back hard enough to raise suspicion. That was his mistake. I hired an estate attorney in Columbus, someone with no connection to our family, no history in our county. I had him submit formal requests for estate documentation. As a beneficiary under Ohio law, I was entitled to full accounting records, business valuations, asset inventories, and copies of all transactions conducted under power of attorney. Marcus's attorney delayed twice. That told me something. The third time, we filed with the probate court. What came back was 460 pages of documents. I spent a week going through them at a table in my Columbus hotel room. I ordered room service twice a day, and I didn't leave except to walk around the parking lot when my eyes got tired. I built a timeline on a legal pad. Then I transferred it to a spreadsheet. Then I had my own firm's forensic software run pattern analysis on the transaction data. The picture that emerged was not subtle. Over a period of roughly 3.5 years, starting about 18 months before my father's death and continuing through the estate settlement, more than $340,000 had moved through accounts that Marcus controlled either as business manager or as power of attorney. Some of it was legitimate: business expenses, vendor payments, employee payroll. But underneath the legitimate transactions was a second layer. A vendor account I didn't recognize had been receiving monthly payments for over 2 years. When I ran the business registration, it traced back to an LLC formed in Marcus's wife's maiden name. The LLC had no website, no box in a town 40 miles away, and no verifiable services rendered. A piece of the farmland, 11 acres on the eastern edge, the most valuable portion because it bordered a state highway, had been quietly transferred to a separate land trust 8 months before my father died. The trustee was a name I didn't know. The notarized signature was my father's, but when I compared it to other documents he had signed during that same period, something looked different. His handwriting by then had already been affected by the illness, and the signature on the transfer document was steady in a way it had no business being. I hired a forensic document examiner, independent, out of Cincinnati. She reviewed the signature samples without knowing what I was looking for. Her conclusion was that the transfer document signature showed significant inconsistencies with authenticated signatures from the same time period and could not be confirmed as genuine. I sat with that report for a long time before I did anything with it. It's a strange thing to have proof that your own brother defrauded your dying father. It doesn't feel like triumph. It feels like something collapsing inside you that you had quietly hoped would stay standing. Marcus and I were never close the way some brothers are. There had always been a competition between us that I never fully understood, some resentment on his part that I couldn't trace to a single cause. But he was still my brother. We had grown up in the same house. I knew his laugh. I knew his kids' names. I had stood next to him at our mother's funeral 14 years ago. None of that changed what was in those documents. I called my attorney in Columbus on a Tuesday morning, and I told him what I had found. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Daniel, this is significant." I knew. He said we needed to move carefully. What I had was strong, but estate fraud cases in Ohio required thorough documentation and expert testimony. He said we should bring in the forensic accountant officially and get the document examiner on record. He said we should also request an independent court-appointed auditor for the business accounts, because if the numbers were as bad as I was describing, there might be criminal exposure. I told him to do all of it. For the next 4 months, I flew back and forth between Phoenix and Columbus. I kept showing up at family events and behaving normally. I sat across from Marcus at a birthday dinner for his oldest daughter in September. I watched him pour wine and tell stories and act like the generous patriarch of a family that respected him. I smiled at the right moments. I asked about his kids' soccer games. I let him believe that the estate paperwork was just taking time. My father used to say that patience was not the same as passivity. He said the difference was knowing what you were waiting for. I knew what I was waiting for. The probate hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in November. Marcus came with his attorney, a man named Gerald Tipton, who handled a lot of estate work in the county, and clearly believed this was a routine matter. I could tell by the way Tipton carried himself when he walked in, unhurried, conversational with the clerk, that he expected a straightforward proceeding. My attorney had filed our documentation with the court 3 weeks earlier. I had reviewed every page. I knew it better than I knew my own apartment. The judge was a woman named Honorable Patricia Yoon, who had been on the probate bench in Franklin County for 11 years. She had a reputation for patience and precision. She did not waste words. When we were seated, she opened the file in front of her and looked up at Marcus. "Mr. Marsh," she said, "before we proceed, I want to give you the opportunity to address certain irregularities your brother's attorneys have identified in the estate accounting." Marcus glanced at Tipton. Tipton leaned over and said something quietly. Then Marcus looked back at the judge with the expression I had seen him use his whole life, the one that said he was the reasonable man in the room, and whatever problem existed was probably someone else's misunderstanding. "Your Honor," Tipton said, "we believe those concerns are based on incomplete information and will be fully addressed during standard accounting review." Judge Yoon nodded once. Then she looked at my attorney. My attorney stood up and presented the forensic accounting timeline. He presented the vendor payments to the LLC. He presented the registration documents showing the beneficial ownership. He presented the land transfer record and the forensic document examiner's report. He was methodical and unhurried, and he spoke to the judge the way you speak to someone who does not need to be impressed, only informed. I watched Marcus as the documents were entered into the record. His expression shifted in small ways that I don't think most people would have noticed. First, there was the slight tightening around his jaw. Then the way he stopped looking at the judge and started looking at the table. Then the stillness that settled over him, the kind that isn't calm. When my attorney finished, the courtroom was quiet. Judge Yoon looked at the documents for a long moment. Then she looked at Marcus directly. "Mr. Marsh," she said, "the vendor payments totaling $214,000 to Clearfield Property Services, LLC. Can you describe the specific services rendered to your father's business by that entity?" Tipton started to interject. The judge held up one hand without looking at him. Marcus opened his mouth. He closed it. He looked at Tipton. Tipton was already leaning away slightly, the way attorneys do when they realize they have walked into something they were not briefed on. Marcus started. "There were consulting services, supply chain management. Do you have invoices?" the judge asked. Silence. "Contracts? Deliverables? Correspondence?" More silence. Judge Yoon turned to the land transfer document. "And this transfer," she said, setting the page on the desk in front of her. "Your brother's forensic document examiner has testified under oath that this signature is inconsistent with your father's authenticated signatures from the same period." She looked at Marcus again. "Were you present when this document was signed?" Marcus's attorney said, "Your Honor, my client." "I'm asking your client," she said quietly. What happened next is hard to describe accurately, because the thing that made it significant wasn't loud. It was the opposite. My brother, who had spent 3.5 years quietly moving money and property out of our father's estate, who had stood in the driveway at the funeral and told me. Our father had never loved me the way he loved the family, who had let me believe for months that I was getting a fair accounting of what my father had left behind. My brother sat in that chair and said nothing, not because he was composing a response, because there was no response left to give. Judge Yoon ordered a full forensic audit of the estate accounts, appointed an independent administrator, and referred the matter to the Franklin County Prosecutor's Office for review of potential criminal violations. She also issued a temporary freeze on any further transfers of estate assets pending the outcome of the audit. She did it all in the same even, unhurried tone she had used throughout, like it was just the next right thing. I walked out of the courthouse into a grey November afternoon and stood on the sidewalk for a minute. My attorney came out behind me and shook my hand. He said we had done well. I thanked him and told him I needed a few minutes. I walked to my car and sat in the parking garage for a while, just letting the quiet sit around me. I hadn't cried at my father's funeral. I hadn't cried through any of those months of document review, the late nights in hotel rooms, the flights, the careful conversations. I'm not sure exactly what I felt sitting in that parking garage. Something between exhaustion and something else I didn't have a word for. Relief, maybe. Or just the absence of the weight I'd been carrying. My father had planned a future for me. He had kept records, just like he always kept records, because he believed a man shouldn't have to rely on memory when paper would do. He had written a will that was clear and fair. What Marcus had done had not erased that. It had only delayed it, and at considerable cost to himself. The forensic audit took 6 months. The full picture that came back was worse than what I had initially found. The total diverted from the estate over the course of Marcus's management exceeded $380,000. Including the 11 acres of farmland that the independent auditor valued at just over $290,000 on its own. There were also undisclosed personal loans Marcus had taken from the business accounts, treated as business expenses, over a period of 4 years. The Franklin County prosecutor charged him with 2 counts of estate fraud and 1 count of forgery related to the land transfer document. He entered a plea agreement 8 months after the hearing. He did not go to prison, which I had conflicting feelings about. He was ordered to make full restitution, which will take years. He lost his position managing the business. The business itself was sold, which was probably inevitable given everything that had happened, and the proceeds were distributed correctly this time, under court supervision. Some family members called me after the plea deal to say they were sorry. A few were genuinely apologetic in a way that seemed real. Some of them had believed Marcus's version of things for so long that they seemed disoriented, like people who had been given bad directions and only realized it after they were already somewhere unfamiliar. I didn't hold it against them. People tend to believe the person who tells the story most confidently and most often. Some family members didn't call. I expected that too. My relationship with Marcus is what it is, which is to say it barely exists. We have exchanged brief, transactional communication a handful of times because the legal process required it. There was no dramatic confrontation, no phone call where he admitted things, or explained himself or apologized. I'm not sure I would have known what to do with an apology from him. Some things don't resolve cleanly, and pretending they do is just another kind of story. What I kept returning to, in the months after everything settled, was something smaller and quieter than the legal outcome. My father had kept a letter in the estate files. It was addressed to me and to Marcus both, written in his own handwriting about 6 weeks before he died, while he was still clear enough to put things into words. It wasn't a dramatic document. It was written in his plain, practical way. The same voice he used when he was teaching me how to read a balance sheet, or explaining why a contract needed to be specific. He wrote that he knew the business had been hard, and that Marcus had given a lot of years to it, and he was grateful for that. But he also wrote that he had always been proud of both of us in different ways, and that everything he had built was meant to give us both a foundation, not a reason to keep score. He wrote that he had tried to be fair, and he hoped we would be fair to each other. I don't know if Marcus ever read that letter. It was part of the estate file, so technically he had access to it. Maybe he did read it and it didn't change anything. Maybe he never looked at it. I've stopped trying to understand the calculation that led him to do what he did. What I know is that my father was not naive. He kept records precisely because he understood that not everything goes the way you intend. He had enough experience watching businesses and families fall apart over money to know that wanting things to be fair and actually making them fair were two different things. He built the evidence into the structure of the estate itself. He just needed someone to find it. I live in Phoenix still. The settlement from the estate, once the restitution process finishes, will amount to significantly less than it should have been. The land is gone. The business is gone. What remains is money, some meaningful, some symbolic, and the knowledge that I did not accept the story I was handed, just because it was handed to me. I think about my father fairly often. I think about the version of him I saw in those records, the careful handwriting, the organized files, the letter he took the time to write when he was running out of time. He was not a sentimental man in obvious ways. He didn't talk about his feelings much or say things directly that he could say through action, but he kept records. He kept every receipt, every contract, every letter, going back 40 years. He left a paper trail that was specific and detailed and impossible to dismiss. I think that was his way of saying, the truth is here if you look for it. I made sure it would be. The thing about growing up being told a certain version of yourself is that eventually you start telling it to yourself. Not loudly, not consciously, but quietly, in the background of every decision, there's this low murmur that says maybe you're the difficult one, the one who left, the one who never cared enough to stay. You don't fight it directly because you can't locate it well enough to argue with. It just lives in you, shaping the edges of how much you expect. What changed after that November morning in the courthouse wasn't just the legal outcome. It was that murmur. I had spent years being the son who wasn't there, the brother who moved away, the one who didn't help enough, didn't contribute enough, didn't earn the right to what the family had built. That was the story I had been handed, and I had carried it longer than I should have. The documents told a different story, not a dramatic one, just an accurate one. My father had provided for me. He had been specific about it. He had written it down and signed it and filed it in the correct place, in the same way he had handled every other piece of important business in his life. That was enough. There's a version of this story that ends with a speech, or a confrontation, or some moment of cinematic resolution where everything is said and understood and forgiven. That's not what happened. What happened was quieter and less satisfying in some ways, and more honest in others. My father built something over 40 years. He wanted it to mean something to both of his sons. That didn't happen the way he intended. But the intention survived. It survived in the records he kept and in the letter he wrote, and in the will he filed. It survived because he understood, maybe better than any of us, that the people you love aren't always going to do right by you, and the best you can do is make the truth available for when someone finally decides to look. I decided to look. That's the whole story. And the man who told me I had never been truly loved by my own father. The man who said that out loud, in a driveway, in front of witnesses, 3 days after we buried him. That man is currently making monthly restitution payments on a court-ordered schedule and has about 9 more years to go. I don't think about that often, but sometimes, on a Tuesday morning, when I'm going through a client's financials and I find the thing that doesn't line up, the small number in the wrong column, the date that's off by just enough, I think about my father keeping his records in that back office for 40 years, and I think, he taught me this. He taught me that the truth doesn't need to be loud. It just needs to be documented.